The winter of 1943 wrapped the North Atlantic in a kind of darkness that felt alive. Waves rose like black mountains. Winds screamed across the water in long, bone-chilling howls. And beneath that endless night, the German U-boats, silent, deadly, confident, moved like ghosts hunting their prey. For nearly 4 years, they had controlled the sea. Convoys feared them. Merchant sailors whispered about them. Even Allied destroyers treated them like underwater predators that could strike without warning and vanish without a trace. To the U-boat crews, the Atlantic belonged to them. They had earned that belief through thousands of sunk ships and countless nights where their torpedoes lit up the sky with burning tankers and broken hulls. Every commander believed he understood the ocean better than any machine or enemy ever could. But in a small, frozen corner of North America, that belief was about to die on the cliffs of Newfoundland, where icy winds cut through even the thickest jackets, stood a wooden radar station unlike anything the Allies had ever built before. It didn't look like a place where history would change. It was just a box-shaped building surrounded by snow, crude antenna towers, and a single American flag that snapped loudly in the wind. Inside, the room smelled faintly of oil, metal, and wet boots drying by a heater that barely worked. Most of the men stationed there were young, so young that many had only recently left high school. Some had grown up in small towns and farms, far from any ocean. Yet now, these same young men were responsible for watching over the most dangerous stretch of water in the world. They had something new at their side, a classified piece of technology so advanced that even most American officers didn't fully understand it. It was called microwave radar, a device that could send out extremely short radio waves capable of cutting through fog, darkness, and storms. It could see what the human eye could not. It could detect what German scientists insisted was impossible for the operators. Working the radar felt like staring into another dimension. The screen glowed with soft green light, and strange dots would appear and disappear like fireflies. They had spent weeks learning what was a bird, what was a fishing boat, what was simply noise. But tonight, something appeared on the screen that none of them expected. A single faint mark moved slowly along the bottom edge. Then another appeared, and another. In less than a minute, the radar was showing a patterned 7 blips, perfectly spaced, all moving information toward the center of the station's coverage area. The young operator, a thin kid from Kansas who dreamed of becoming an engineer after the war, froze for a moment as he stared at the screen. Then his training kicked in. He called out for his supervisor with a voice that trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. The supervisor rushed over, studied the pattern, and immediately understood what he was seeing. These weren't fishing boats. These weren't stray signals. These were U-boats traveling on the surface, grouped together like wolves preparing to strike. The ocean was too dark for aircraft to spot them visually. The night was too quiet for destroyers to hear them, but the radar station saw them clearly, almost as if the water had turned into glass. For the first time in the entire war, the U-boats were completely exposed. The supervisor grabbed the radio and contacted the nearest escort carrier group. His voice was calm, but the message he delivered was something no American pilot had ever heard before. We have multiple enemy submarines on the surface. Exact coordinates. Repeat, exact coordinates on the carrier miles away. Pilots were jolted awake and rushed to their aircraft. Some thought it was a drill. Others thought there must be some mistake. Hunting U-boats had always been a slow, frustrating process filled with long hours staring at empty ocean. But tonight was different. Radar had done what eyes and ears could never do. Back in the station, the young operators watched the blips on the screen with a mix of excitement and anxiety. One of them whispered that it felt like cheating. Another said it felt like they were finally getting revenge for all the convoys lost over the years. But underneath their comments was a deeper emotion: fear. Fear that the U-boats might discover the station. Fear that their new technology might fail. Fear that if anything went wrong, the young pilots racing toward the target could end up in the freezing ocean with no hope of rescue. Far out at sea, the Wolfpack cruised comfortably on the surface. The captains stood on their bridges breathing in the cold air, enjoying the silence of a night they believed they owned. To them, the darkness was safety, a blanket that had protected them for years. They had no idea that an invisible beam of radar was sweeping across the ocean, tracking every movement they made. They had no idea that the Americans could see them with perfect clarity. They felt safe. They felt untouchable. And that confidence would be their downfall. Inside the radar station, one operator leaned close to the screen. He watched the tiny blips shift slightly as the U-boats began to change speed. He wondered what the German captains were talking about at that exact moment. Probably discussing where to attack the next convoy. Probably laughing about how easy the night crossing would be. The operator tightened his jaw. Part of him felt pity. Part of him felt anger. But most of him felt a rising sense of responsibility. He wasn't holding a gun. He wasn't dropping bombs. But he knew that what he was doing would decide the fate of hundreds of men, both American and German, when the pilots finally reached the area. They radioed the radar station for confirmation. The reply came instantly. Targets unchanged. You are right on top of them, and above the sleeping U-boat crews. The sound of approaching engines began to grow. The roar of American aircraft cut through the icy night like a blade. It was a sound the U-boat captains were not supposed to hear, not here. Not now. Not in weather this dark and unforgiving. For years, they had surfaced confidently during nights like this one, knowing Allied planes were essentially blind after sunset. But tonight, the darkness betrayed them. The black sky above seemed empty, the sea around them calm, and not even the sharpest lookout had sensed danger. Then a sudden echo bounced of the water, a hum, distant but rising fast. One officer lifted his binoculars, confused. Aircraft? At this hour? In this weather? It didn't make sense. Before he could finish the thought, the first flare burst overhead, turning the night into a ghostly white day. The U-boats were caught in the light like insects pinned under glass. The sudden brightness stood the crew's eyes, and panic erupted almost immediately. Orders were shouted. Men scrambled across the decks. Engines roared to full power. But the sea betrayed them again. In the panic, several U-boats collided in the hurry to dive, metal hitting metal with deep, painful groans. The wolfpack that had moved in perfect formation minutes ago was now breaking apart like scattered debris above them. American pilots saw everything, the silhouettes of submarines glistening under the flare light, the frantic movements of crewmen, the conning tower sliding beneath the waves. One pilot could not believe the sight. It's like they're trying to hide in daylight, he muttered. Another replied. Radar did this. We're finally hunting them on our terms. They dove low. Engines screaming. Bombs armed. Inside U-boat U-413. Captain Lieutenant Eric Vollmer knew they were finished the moment he heard the planes. He had lived through 2 years of the Atlantic War. He had seen destroyers charging toward him, convoys firing wildly in desperation, and even close calls with depth charges that rattled his bones. But this was different. This enemy had found him in a place no enemy had ever found him before. On the bridge, he yelled for an emergency dive. His crew obeyed instantly, trained by countless drills. The boat tilted downward, water rushing over the deck, the cold Atlantic grabbing hold of the steel hull. Vollmer stayed above until the last possible second, shouting orders to the men still topside. Then he jumped down the hatch, sealing it behind him just as a bomb exploded near the bow. The shockwave slammed everyone inside against the walls. Lights flickered. Gauges rattled. Somewhere behind him, a young sailor cried out as he was thrown against a valve wheel. But the boat kept sinking, deeper and deeper, escaping into the blackness below. Vollmer steadied himself, grabbed a pipe for balance, and shouted for damage reports. His crew responded quickly, their voices tense but controlled. They were frightened, but they were sailors of the Atlantic. They knew fear well. What they didn't know was how the enemy had found them. That mystery shook them more than the explosion. Back on the surface, American planes circled like hawks. They dropped depth charges with precision, guided entirely by the radar coordinates streamed from the station hundreds of miles away. Every splash, every explosion, sent shockwaves through the sea. Underwater, the U-boats felt the ocean convulse violently. Steel groaned. Rivets bent. Pipes shuddered. For many crews, it felt like the sea itself had turned against them. Inside the radar station, the young operators listened to the pilot's updates. Their screen showed the wolfpack scattering, blips splitting apart, trying desperately to escape. But the radar saw everything. Every change in movement. Every attempt to dive shallow or deep. Every direction change. They called out coordinates calmly, almost mechanically, but their hearts pounded. One operator whispered, "They're running blind. They have no idea how we're doing this." Another replied softly, "If they knew, they'd never come back." Out in the Atlantic, U-boat U-329 attempted a risky maneuver, surfacing again to accelerate. The captain believed the planes might have passed and that diving too deep in these waters could crush the hull. When the submarine broke back onto the surface, its crew took deep breaths of freezing air, praying the skies were empty. They were wrong. A torpedo bomber spotted them immediately and swooped down. The captain barely had time to shout before the bomb hit the water beside them, exploding with terrifying force. The shockwave ripped open the side of the hull. Seawater surged in. Lights went out. Alarms wailed. The men screamed as the boat tilted violently, filling fast. Within minutes, U-329 was gone, swallowed whole by the ocean that had once protected it, on another submarine. U-584, the chief engineer, stared at the sonar screen with a hollow expression. He was in his 40s, older than most, with lines carved deep into his face from years beneath the waves. He had survived convoy attacks, depth charge hunts, machine gun strafings, and mechanical failures that would have killed lesser crews. But now, sitting in the dim red-lit control room, he felt something he had never felt before: helplessness. No destroyer had spotted them. No lookout had spotted aircraft. No radio message had warned them. And yet the enemy knew exactly where they were. It made no sense. It felt supernatural. Whispers spread among the younger crewmen that the Allies had created some kind of invisible eye that could see through storms and darkness. An eye that watched them even now. U-584's captain ordered the boat to run silent. Engines slowed. Lights dimmed. Conversations dropped to whispers. But running silent didn't matter. The American aircraft above weren't using sound. They were using guidance sent from a radar station the Germans didn't know existed. And within minutes, the bombers dropped a perfect pattern of depth charges directly along U-584's path. The ocean erupted around the hull. Men were thrown across compartments. The engineer hit the wall hard enough to break a rib. The boat tilted sharply as multiple compartments took in water on the surface. Pilots saw oil slicks spreading across the waves, proof that their guided ambush was working. One pilot reported, "I've never seen them panic like this. They're not fighting back. They're just trying to survive." The radio crackled with confirmation from the radar station. Targets weakening. Maintain pressure. Inside the command room of the station, the supervisor realized something important. This wasn't just a successful strike. This was the moment the German Navy would learn that the ocean was no longer safe, not even at night, not even in storms, not even with their best wolf packs. The rules of warfare were changing forever, and the U-boats were learning that lesson in the most brutal way possible. The Atlantic dawn came slowly, as if even the sun hesitated to rise over the wreckage scattered across the waves. The first hints of blue and grey revealed oil slicks stretching like bruises on the ocean's skin. Small pieces of debris, wood, metal, clothing floated silently. The American pilots circling overhead saw it all in the early morning light. The stark evidence that hours of radar-guided attacks had turned one of the German Navy's most confident wolfpacks into a graveyard. Some pilots felt triumph. Others felt a grim heaviness. War never let a man feel only one thing. Down below, in U-413, Captain Lieutenant Vollmer crouched beside a flickering light, gripping a steel bar to steady himself as the submarine creaked under pressure. The night had been a nightmare. Depth charges above them, explosions that rolled through the hull like thunder, alarms screaming. Now the boat was deeper than Vollmer wanted, deeper than he trusted. The pressure was changing the sound of the submarine, bending metal in ways he could feel in his bones. His crew stared at him with wide, anxious eyes, waiting for orders, waiting for reassurance. He forced his voice to stay steady as he ordered a slow ascent. Every man on board knew surfacing might expose them again, but staying deep meant certain death. The ocean could crush them as easily as an empty Candata Su-413 rose. The water grew colder, and the sounds around them changed. The groaning hull relaxed slightly. The engines hummed without strain. When they finally broke the surface, the crew scrambled to the conning tower, gasping for fresh air, scanning the horizon for aircraft. For a moment, the world was quiet. No planes, no bombs, no smoke, just endless grey water under a pale morning sky. Vollmer felt relief wash through him, but it didn't last long. To the west, he saw something drifting oil, and a torn piece of metal with a number painted on it. A number he recognized. His friend's submarine. The realization hit him hard. U-329 and U-584 were gone. Boats he had shared meals with, laughed with, planned attacks with. Men he had trained with, men he respected. The ocean that had been their home had become their tomb in a single night. But even more disturbing was the unknown force that had destroyed them. Vollmer couldn't stop thinking about it. How did they find us? He muttered to himself. How did they know exactly where we were? The question gnawed at him, twisting inside his mind like a cold knife. Inside the radar station, the operators were exhausted. Their shift had lasted far longer than expected, and the tension had drained them. Some sat slumped in chairs, rubbing their eyes. Others paced quietly to calm their nerves. But none of them forgot what they had witnessed. For the first time in the entire war, The U-boats hadn't acted like predators. They had acted like prey. And the realization that a handful of men in a small wooden building had crippled a wolfpack filled the room with an eerie sense of power. The supervisor walked between them, checking on each man, offering a nod or a pat on the shoulder. He knew this was only the beginning. If radar could do this once, it could do it again, and again, and again. Far out at sea, a small rescue plane spotted a life raft. The pilot dipped his wing and radioed the coordinates to a nearby destroyer. The survivors were German sailors, exhausted, shivering, covered in oil. When they were hauled aboard, they looked less like enemy soldiers and more like men who had seen something that shattered their understanding of the world. The American sailors expected anger or defiance. Instead, they saw confusion. One German survivor kept repeating the same thing in a trembling voice. They came from the sky in the dark. That is not possible. The sky was blind. He said it over and over until a medic led him away. On the surviving U-boat still submerged, radios crackled with messages from headquarters. Some captains reported attacks. Others reported heavy damage. A few sent desperate warnings. Enemy aircraft locating us at night. Unknown method. Avoid surface at all costs. The German command center in Lorient received the messages with mounting disbelief. Their analysts insisted the Allies had no technology capable of night detection at long range. Their scientists had assured them radar was too weak to track submarines in the open ocean. And yet, the reports kept coming, each more frantic than the last. Within hours, panic spread through the German Navy's communications network. Admirals demanded answers. Commanders argued. Some believed the Allies had broken their codes. Others believed there were traitors among them. A few suggested something far more terrifying, that the Allies had created a new weapon capable of turning the battlefield invisible. But without proof, they could do nothing but speculate. Meanwhile, U-413 continued limping westward. Vollmer ordered the crew to stay on the surface, moving slowly to conserve fuel. He gathered his officers in the small control room, the atmosphere heavy with exhaustion and fear. "We cannot fight what we cannot see," he said quietly. One officer clenched his jaw. Another lowered his eyes. Vollmer added, "If they can find us at night, then the old rules are gone." The truth hung in the air like a weight no one wanted to acknowledge. A lookout on the bridge suddenly shouted. Vollmer rushed up the ladder, heart pounding. But this time, the danger wasn't a plane. It was a convoy, a massive one steaming confidently across the horizon. The escorts moved in a protective ring around the merchant ships, their guns pointed outward, their radars turning. The sight shocked the German captain. Before radar, convoys had been terrified to sail through areas known for wolfpacks. But now, the Allies were moving with an ease that was almost arrogant. Vollmer narrowed his eyes. This wasn't luck. This was strategy. This was confidence born from knowledge. Knowledge the Germans didn't have. He ordered a change of course. The U-boat slipped beneath the waves again, but not with the boldness of past patrols. This dive was slow, cautious, almost fearful. The crew moved quietly, as if expecting death to fall on them at any moment. The ocean was no longer their hunting ground. It was a trap, one that could spring shut without warning. Back in Germany, Admiral Karl Dönitz slammed his fist on the table as he listened to the latest reports. He had built the U-boat fleet into a weapon of terror, a force that once threatened to starve Britain into surrender. Now that fleet was bleeding. The old tactic, surface at night, strike from darkness, had become useless overnight. And the Admiral knew something far worse. Change in war was like a storm. If you didn't adapt fast enough, you drowned. He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant, and whispered to his staff, "Find out how they did it. If we cannot see what they see, the Atlantic is lost." What he didn't know was that the key to their defeat was not a fleet of ships, nor a network of spies, nor a squadron of new aircraft. It was a small radar station on a lonely, frozen cliff manned by boys who hardly understood the power they held. And that station was still watching, by the second night. The radar station stood in total silence. The kind of silence that comes only after something enormous has happened. Something that everyone feels but no one fully understands yet. Snow drifted across the wooden roof. The antenna towers hummed softly in the wind. Inside, the glow of the radar screen lit the faces of the young operators, all of them pale with exhaustion but alert, waiting for what might come next. The sea was still full of danger, and no one assumed the wolfpack was completely gone. Their job was to watch, to listen, to keep the invisible eye open. Shortly after midnight, the radar screen flickered again. A single blip appeared far to the east, then another, then two more. The supervisor leaned over the operator's shoulder, studying the pattern. These weren't surface ships. These weren't planes. These were submarines moving slowly, erratically, as if wounded animals trying to crawl away from a predator. The remains of the wolf pack. The room tensed. No one cheered. No one shouted. They just watched. The supervisor made a decision. This time, there would be no immediate airstrike. The pilots had been flying for nearly 20 hours straight. The ocean was rougher now, the winds unpredictable. Instead, he forwarded the coordinates to the nearest destroyer group. Within minutes, the ships adjusted course, engines roaring as they cut through the waves toward the fleeing U-boats out on the Atlantic. On the deck of U-413, Captain Lieutenant Vollmer stared into the darkness. His crew had barely slept. Their hands shook from exhaustion and cold. Their eyes were sunken. Yet Vollmer stood tall, gripping the rail, refusing to show weakness. He had one goal now, survival. Not victory, not glory, just getting his men home. But the ocean betrayed him once again. A faint vibration traveled through the hull propellers, powerful ones growing louder. Destroyers. Vollmer didn't hesitate. Dive, dive, he yelled. The men obeyed instantly, sliding down the hatch, sealing it just as water flooded the deck. The submarine descended into darkness again. But as they sank, something horrifying reminded them of the night before. The depth charges began falling with perfect accuracy, each one landing close enough to rattle the submarine violently. How? How could the destroyers know their exact position in a sea this vast? The pressure inside the boat rose with every explosion. Panels shook loose. A pipe burst, spraying freezing water across the control room. The chief engineer worked furiously to patch it, his hands trembling, his mind racing with the same fear shared by every man aboard. The enemy sees us. They know where we are. We are not hidden above them. The destroyers moved with a confidence that bordered on ruthless efficiency. They didn't wonder. They didn't guess. They followed the coordinates fed to them from a radar station far across the continent. Every turn they made, every depth charge they dropped, was a calculated move. The U-boats were not opponents tonight. They were targets. As dawn approached, U-413's hull groaned under the strain. Vollmer knew they couldn't survive another bombardment. He gathered his officers and spoke with the calmness of a man who had accepted the truth. We surface at first light, he said. We cannot dive again. If the aircraft return, we surrender. The word tasted bitter, but it was the only option left. His officers nodded reluctantly. They were men of the sea. They understood survival sometimes required humility. When the submarine surfaced, a destroyer spotted it immediately. But instead of opening fire, the American captain hesitated. He saw men on the deck holding up a white sheet. The U-boat was surrendering, something unheard of at this stage of the war. The Americans approached cautiously, weapons ready, but the Germans offered no resistance. They were exhausted, broken, humbled by a force they did not understand. The destroyer's captain stared across the water at Vollmer, who saluted him weakly, a gesture of respect between warriors. The Americans took the crew aboard. The German sailors sat quietly on deck, wrapped in blankets, staring at the sea. One young German, barely 20, whispered to an American medic, "How did you find us in the dark?" The medic looked at him and simply said, "We didn't." Someone else did. He nodded toward the west, toward a distant land the Germans had never seen, where an unseen machine spun in the night, back at the radar station. The operators listened to the final report from the destroyer group. U-413 surrendered, others likely destroyed. Area secure. The room didn't erupt into applause. Instead, the men sat still, absorbing the magnitude of what they had done. They had defeated a wolf pack without firing a gun. They had changed naval warfare from inside a small wooden building with antennas that looked too fragile to matter. One operator finally whispered, "The ocean isn't theirs anymore." The supervisor nodded. "It never will be again." News traveled fast. Within days, German intelligence intercepted reports of multiple U-boats lost without a fight. Rumors spread among U-boat crews stationed in France and Norway. Men who once boasted about their invincibility now spoke in hushed tones about the invisible enemy. Some refused to sail. Others questioned their commanders. A few wrote letters home expressing doubt for the first time since the war began. Admiral Dick saw the change and felt the fear settling in his fleet like a cold fog. He knew morale was breaking not because of bombs, but because of something worse. Uncertainty. Technology had become a ghost haunting the German Navy, a ghost they could not see or fight. Meanwhile, the Allies expanded their radar network. More stations were built. More planes were fitted with radar receivers. More convoys sailed boldly through the night. Radar wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a new kind of weapon, silent, invisible, unstoppable. And the German Navy realized something that broke their spirit more than any battle could. The ocean had chosen a new master. The era of the U-boats was over.